Hi, and welcome to my lecture. I'm very happy that you're here. This is going to be a lecture about global challenges of the LGBTQ plus community. I just want to start this lecture by saying, well, hello to everyone, and you are very welcome. And I'm really glad that this is something you chose for yourself and to educate yourself on. My name is Rhea. I'm a debater from Slovenia. Right now, I'm already a coach, but I also do debate. I live and study in the Netherlands. I study psychology and neuroscience, but I also work for the Dutch Debate Association. I also help with Slovenian debating. It's just a passion of mine. So the thing about the LGBTQ plus culture and history is that most of us haven't been offered any formal education on it in our education system because it's just not part of the curriculum. So any knowledge that you might have on it is usually due to curiosity on your part. It's usually due to you researching about it, you talking to your friends about it, to your family. So I understand that most of you come here with very different areas of knowledge. For some of you, all of this might be new, and for some of you, all of this might be already familiar. But regardless of that, I do hope that for each and every one of you, there will be something in this lecture that you would be able to take with you, even like after this academy, even after this symposium. All right, so very quickly, what is the outline of this elective? So first we'll talk a little bit about the history of LGBTQ+. I think it's critical for every member, but also non-member of the community to just know how it all began. We're gonna talk about the HIV epidemic. Later on, we'll talk about marriage equality, then issues specific to every intersection of the LGBTQ+ community. We're going to talk about colonialism and non-Western issues, then pop culture, and lastly about what are current challenges that a community faces. Now, I do just want to preface this by saying that I will be using LGBT for most of this lecture just because it is more handy to use if I'll be saying it so much, but just know that I am including all possible intersections and minorities under that umbrella term. We're just talking about the rainbow community and all colors that go within it. Okay, now there are a few trigger warnings. There will not be anything very explicit in this lecture, but I just wanted to mention them in case it's relevant for anyone. So these are the things that I will be discussing in the lecture, just to keep in mind. All right, so let's talk about the history of LGBTQ plus community. It definitely did not start in the 1960s, but this is an event which was critical for the development of activism and for the development of the movement as it is today. By the way, I just want to mention that every time under the title, I will be including a debate motion related to the topic I'm talking about. So you can immediately link this to debates. These are motions which appear very, very often. So I think it's just very useful to just have them hand in hand with the topic we're talking about. So Stonewall riots. So they happened on June 1969. And what exactly happened is in New York, there was a gay bar which was very welcoming for all different kinds of communities. It was also a squatting place for the homeless. It was a place where immigrants, homeless people, different kinds of minorities felt safe. It was basically some sort of a safe house for people who were marginalized at the time. There was a police riot which occurred on that date. The police the police raid was not the first raid that the police had done of the place, but it was one which sparked violent protests because the raid was very violent itself. It kicked people out of the bar. It showed disrespect of the community. And then as a response, people from the bar started protesting. Now the protests were violent as well from both sides, but what's incredibly important about it is that that was a rise of safe places for the community. That's when people started acknowledging that the LGBT community, as well as other communities which are marginalized, do need safe places where they can just stay, get food, they can talk about their culture, they can express themselves the way they want to, and that's something which is not present in the current society. And that's how this development of more safe spaces and bars and houses happen. Now, as a result, also pride marches emerge in the next few years. So 1 year later, after the Stonewall riots in New York, LA, San Francisco, so all over America, first Pride marches or Pride parades took place. And then 1 year later, this also spread all across the globe. So we can see that also in the in different European countries, Pride parades took place 2 years afterwards. So it definitely was a very meaningful event for the LGBT community, but especially because it showed that oftentimes police are not friendly towards marginalized communities. And in this case, violent protesting was almost necessary in order for these people to defend themselves. So that would be the meaning behind the protests. All right, so years later, there was the HIV or the AIDS epidemic. I'm sure we all know a lot about it, but I think something that's oftentimes forgotten is how it was treated at the time and how bad the response was, especially from people who should have done better, especially from politicians, from health organizations, and so on. So the first drug which was approved for treatment and had some positive outcomes was approved in 1987, very, very late. Um, by that time, like tons of people already died and suffered and lost so much. PrEP was approved in 2012. Now, this is perhaps the most effective prevention drug for HIV to this day. It's highly effective. And something that is especially important to know about HIV is the U equals U, which means that undetectable means untransmittable. So once you are infected with HIV, but it can no longer be detected with different tests, that means you also cannot transmit it onto other people. What is the impact of all of this in the community and why I think it's so important to talk about this? Well, discrimination in the 80s was incredibly damaging to people's lives. And the fact that there was an HIV epidemic, that was used as a justification for more discrimination. So before the actual term HIV and AIDS, there were terms like gay disease, gay cancer, and so on. And so often people with the disease were declined treatment, especially in state hospitals. And of course, a lot of these people did not afford private healthcare or any healthcare at all. So in most cases, they were left alone without any support system and without any safety net. Um, a very interesting thing that differs in the United States versus a lot of other countries, especially in Europe, is that the FDA was refusing to develop the drug and was holding up the development process of the drug, and that was done mostly for reasons of discrimination and without any good justification on their part. So while a lot of other countries in Europe already had the drug available, or were developing different kinds of treatment for patients with HIV, the United States, due to FDA and due to rampant discrimination, were a few years behind when it comes to that. Last thing to mention here is that, well, people who are members of LGBTQ community have always been discriminated when it comes to employment, but this served as another reason for which they didn't want people with the disease in the workplace, or they assumed that anybody who comes from the community also carries the disease. And there was big fear of the disease spreading because people were misinformed, and that was just another reason causing unemployment and causing poverty among the community. Okay, so then let's talk about marriage equality. Now, marriage equality, I think, in Western countries is in the last 20 years something which has seen incredible changes and incredible progress. A very popular motion I've encountered at least 3 times is this house regrets the community's focus on advocating for marriage equality. And I think this is a very interesting motion because the community has truly been focusing on marriage equality when it comes to pushing their political agenda. And then what would be an alternative to that? What would you talk about as opposition? Well, there are other goals which would have been perhaps more achievable and perhaps also achieved sooner in time than marriage equality. Because a lot of people say that marriage equality is just on paper, and it's just about that social recognition and being recognized on paper, but it doesn't really help individuals that much. It might have been perhaps more useful to help with affordable housing for the community or help with employment. So if you encounter a debate, those are alternatives that you can mention. However, even though some people think that marriage equality is just about a piece of paper and just about being recognized by the state, it is not as simple as that. It actually encompasses a lot of other benefits you get once you are married to someone. So, what are certain implications? Well, the first one is just adoption. First of all, it is much easier to adopt in a lot of countries if you are married with someone. And also, if one of the partners adopts and something happens to the other partner, such as death, prison, and so on, it is very dangerous for the child in the sense of it could get taken away by the state or by some other institution because not both parents have the legal custody of the child. So you should know that there are many more implications when it comes to adoption for why two people should be married when adopting. Another thing is just next of kin, having that second person that takes care of you if you are in a hospital to know who they call. Home ownership, it is much, much easier to buy a house, to just attain any kind of home ownership if you are married, also to get a credit for it. Next thing is health insurance. So you can get health insurance from your spouse. This is something that mainly happens here in the United States, but from my understanding, oftentimes you get your insurance from the work of your spouse. And that is something which is just not enabled to you in this scenario. And lastly, visas. It's a lot easier to get a visa if you are married. So that is for the debate of regretting the focus on marriage equality, but just in general, so you know why the LGBTQ community has been focusing so much of their time, attention, and money on marriage equality. Okay, so now I want to look more into specific issues of different intersections within the LGBTQ plus community. So first, I want to take a look into gay and bisexual men and what are specific issues that they face in the modern world. So something that's very clear is that there's still a lot of stigma around their sexuality. They are not welcome in most places to show their public affection, to just be sexual beings in the way that heterosexual people are. So every day we see heterosexual couples kissing outside, they normally hold hands. It is also perfectly normal to see movies in which we see sexual relations between heterosexual couples, but there is such stigma among the gay community and how their sexuality is perceived. So that results in severe mental health issues because they are not able to fully express themselves and also present themselves as sexual beings to the extent that they want to. Another issue that I want to mention is toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity is a term which has been popularized in the last few years, but specifically in this context, it refers to this culture among gay men where they discriminate against more effeminate men, discriminate against men who present themselves in a more feminine way, oftentimes wear makeup, talk in a more traditionally or stereotypically female way, and there is promotion of hyper-masculine culture, so of muscles, those traditional stereotypes of men drinking beer, playing sports, objectifying women. That is to some extent promoted. And if you are not part of that circle, you are ostracized and you are also shamed in certain contexts. Toxic masculinity is something that is specifically dangerous within the gay community. And then last issue I want to mention is the fetishization of body types. So that is something that might be unexpected to a lot of people, but there is a lot of body shaming in the gay community because there are certain ideals, ideal body types with perfect muscles, perfect abs, perfect hair, and so on. And if you are not part of that archetype, you are discriminated against. So oftentimes on dating apps, a lot of men will have in their bio, no fats, no femmes, as an example. So they don't want people who are overweight, they don't want people who look effeminate, oftentimes also against the Asian community specifically. So there's a lot of body shaming within the community, which is very toxic. Now, what are issues specific to lesbian and bisexual women? So first of all, women are already discriminated on the basis of their gender. So there is an intersection of sexism and homophobia. That means that a lot of women are already seen as inferior, are already talked down on, are already objectified on a daily basis. Once people find out you are also the member of the lesbian or bisexual community, that adds one stereotype on the other, and you are more likely to be discriminated, ostracized, shamed, and so on. Another very dark topic is also corrective rape. Corrective rape is, well, what it states is usually men raping women with the intention of correcting their sexuality. Luckily, there has been less and less of that throughout the years, but it's still something which very unfortunately happens. And the rate of sexual assault and rape amongst the LGBTQ community of women is a lot higher than that of the heterosexual population. And corrective rape is part of the reason why that is so. So something more specific for bisexual women, well, that's also true for bisexual men, is bi erasure and biphobia within the community, meaning that also within the community itself, people who are lesbian or gay do not fully recognize bisexuals. They think they are intruders, they think they're just someone who hasn't decided yet what they want, or they are on the way to become fully lesbian or fully gay. Oftentimes they just believe that being bisexual doesn't really exist, and that is also a basis for discrimination. So something which is incredibly heart-wrenching is that the hate is coming from the community as well, even though that's supposed to be a safe space. Okay, so what are issues which are specific to trans people and non-binary people? So the first area of concerns is legal recognition. A lot of the times, well, in most countries in the world, trans and non-binary people still do not have legal recognition. That is especially damaging for trans people who are continuously misgendered and continuously mistreated because of their expression. And oftentimes, law requires invasive procedures for someone to successfully transition. Meaning oftentimes individuals have to sterilize or undergo hormone treatment, which is incredibly invasive, even if they don't want to do that, in order to get a passport or a new ID card of their preference. So that is sort of an invasion into their bodily autonomy and invasion into their privacy. And it is completely unnecessary because it is really up to them to decide whether they want to undergo also medical changes or not. They also face big issues with travel. Oftentimes their IDs are just rejected. They're not let into certain countries. Now, of course, traveling is a privilege in and of itself, but it is a big issue if you have to travel for whatever reason and you are just rejected, you are discriminated, you have to go back on the plane and cancel your vacation, or if you had any necessary travels, you are not able to do so. And then lastly, access to healthcare. Now, as I already mentioned before, there are treatment processes like hormone treatment and sterilization and top surgery, for example. But those are very expensive procedures, and healthcare insurance does not cover them in most countries exactly because of legal recognition in the first place. So most people who are trans cannot even afford to undergo these procedures in the first place, even if they wanted to. Okay, and then another area of issues is just social recognition. This is kind of analogous to issues of the LGB segments I was talking about earlier, but just continuous disrespect in forms of respecting someone's pronouns and just having to prove to people your identity exists. Because a lot of people, especially older generations, just do not know about non-binary people yet, just because they have not been exposed to that in their lifetime, or they're not very familiar with what being trans exactly means. So oftentimes you just have to assert yourself to the point where in whichever setting you come into, you have to prove that whatever you are a valid person with a valid identity, and that can be incredibly exhausting. A small comment that I want to make is oftentimes I hear from especially older generations, but just mixed people, that they have nothing against trans people or non-binary people, but it's not their duty to respect them and to call them whatever they want. If a trans person wants to use certain pronouns, they can, but why should I have to change myself for that and adapt every day? And something which is just very unfortunate is respecting someone costs you nothing. And even if you who are listening to this lecture do not fully understand different sexual identities and orientations, it's not always about fully understanding them, but basic respect doesn't cost you anything. And that's a good place to start, even if you don't understand it. So always keep in mind, respect costs nothing for you to do. And even if you don't understand sexuality or personal identity, that is okay. You can still respect someone. Okay, so you can take a short break now. Feel free to pause, take a few minutes. I'll be continuing whenever you're back. Right. Welcome back if you are back. Okay, so now let's make this a little bit more global and let's look at issues around the world, because a lot of what I've been talking about so far, they are valid issues, but oftentimes they're limited to Western world where we are more privileged. We do have more legally recognized rights, and there's also more social acceptance in the last decade. So there is slightly different scenario in a lot of other countries around the world. First, I wanted to talk about colonialism and imperialism and what effect that has had on the LGBTQ community. So LGBT rights are definitely not a Western concept. It is not just true that the West is just more progressive and always has been, and all other countries are just backwards. That is absolutely false. A very striking statistic is that 67% of the countries that have illegal same-sex marriage and relationships were part of the British Empire. And that was not legal formally in those countries before that. It might have been frowned upon, it might have been part of their religion to be against it, but it was not illegal to be a person who is gay or lesbian or something else. So that for me is really important because it indicates how much of the hatred has been just imported by the West and by their ideology, by their religion in certain cases. Another thing is two gender dichotomy is a colonial imposition. So the fact that there is just two genders, as a lot of people say, the fact that there is just male and female is something which was imported by the West and has not always been the case according to local cultures. An example of that would be Hira. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Hira is a legally recognized third gender in a lot of countries in Asia. Now, it is not the same as being non-binary, that in the sense that we know, non-binary in the sense of the LGBT community, but Hira is a cultural and religious concept that they have known for centuries, and it has been something which has existed long before the rise of the LGBT movement. So this idea that we only have two genders is absolutely imposed and is not something which has traditionally been part of cultures all over the world. What are the big motions you can encounter when it comes to colonialism? I think these are really important because they do not limit themselves to the West and because they offer a slightly wider perspective. So if you ever get into a context where you can suggest a motion to debate, these are the ones that I would suggest, just to widen people's horizons. Okay, yeah, feel free to take pictures of the motions if you will ever need them. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is pop culture, so slightly lighter topic, and also a topic which is just a bit more fun and I'm very passionate about. Okay, so first I want to talk about queer baiting. Now, in case you don't know what queer baiting is, it's a term which has been more popular in the last few years. It means media using people who seem gay or seem to be part of the LGBT community, but never really taking it through all the way. So for example, two women who obviously have chemistry, who in reality probably would be, for example, a lesbian couple, but not really showing them kissing, not showing them actually going into relationship and so on. So it's kind of tempting the LGBT community to watch that show, to be very hopeful of seeing any romance that is representative for them, but not actually seeing those characters be actually LGBT. So oftentimes shows use LGBT characters for tokenization. So they use one LGBT character. Very often there's just one gay man, one lesbian woman, and that is it. And they often fetishize them. Sorry for the typo right there, but they often fetishize them to the point where they make being lesbian, for example, their whole personality, or making someone's gay identity their whole personality. And then another very unfortunate thing is that characters which are of the LGBT community are often just playing very, very small roles, so they can easily be cut out. And a prominent example is in the last Star Wars movie that came out, I think, 1, 2 years ago. There is a very short scene of two women kissing after a battle. It's a few seconds long. It's the only LGBT direct scene that we see in the whole series. And a lot of people celebrated it. And I do acknowledge that there are positive impacts of that, and that is some representation. But first of all, that is tokenization because they're using that one couple and those 3 seconds as a token for the community. And then the franchise can say, ha, but we have had that in our series, even though that there hasn't been actual any storyline or any real characters with their backstory, their whole identity shown online. And oftentimes these characters only get a few seconds, so those scenes can easily be cut out to be sold to certain countries where being gay or LGBT is still illegal. So in Star Wars specifically, that scene was a couple of seconds. When they sold the movie to China for their theaters, they cut that out and they made it easy to be cut out. And then last thing is that sexuality is not displayed on screen. So even if we know the two characters are LGBT, their sexuality will probably not be shown because that's something which most people still find uncomfortable. And of course, people who make movies, who make series, do not want to make viewers uncomfortable. An example of that would be Modern Family with Mitch and Cam, so the gay couple, which are one of the protagonists. They show a lot less actual sexuality and sexual indications that they have sex or that they kiss or they hug than all other couples, which is because it would make people uncomfortable. But the way we make people more comfortable with it would actually be more exposure. So it's kind of a vicious circle. Now, what are problematic tropes we can talk about? I'm just going to mention a few. I'm sure once I mention it, you will be able to recognize them. But these tropes are problematic because they just show stereotypes of these characters without actually going more in depth in them and showing that being LGBT is not the only aspect of their identity, is just one of the aspects. So first one is gay best friend. That I think is the most popular one. So a man who is a gay best friend to the main female protagonist. An example would be Stanley from Sex and the City. They're often over-sexualized, especially lesbians and bisexual women. There's a stereotype of bisexual who cheats. So for example, a female bisexual who is in a relationship with a man and then cheats on him with a woman. That is such a common trope. Such a common trope, but it's very unfortunate because it pushes this further narrative that bisexual people are just promiscuous, they just want it all, they're overly sexual. And lastly, even if there is one character which is better developed, they're oftentimes stereotypical. So if that would be a gay man, for example, they would dress in a certain way, they would talk in a certain way, they would behave in a certain way. And that's obviously very damaging because that's absolutely not how most of people look like. There is huge diversity among the community. So it's very damaging that there's only one representation of it. Okay, so now I want to direct myself a bit more into debating and how to use any of this for debate purposes. So I want to talk about one specific mechanism which you can use in a lot of debates when you're talking about whether we should prioritize legal or social change. Now, the reason why you are forced to prioritize is because there are limited resources. So, for example, you debate as LGBT movement, you cannot prioritize everything because you have limited time, you do not have many resources, you do not have enough people to support. So how do you choose and which one to choose when you're in a debate? So if you have to defend legal change and legal progress, so for example, advocating for certain legislation, such as advocating for gay marriage, advocating for improvement of healthcare, how you argue is you show that once we legalize something, that causes normalization. So that also leads to social change. So, oh, I'm very sorry, there's something I didn't delete from the previous slide. But so the mechanism you're using here is normalization, and the way you describe it is you say, Once people encounter something more and more in their daily life, such as seeing more people who are LGBT and are married, that means that they will psychologically get used to it. And that also means that they will break certain barriers which they have had in their minds. They will have less stereotypes and their prejudices will be tackled. So, in that way, they will also socially be more accepting of people of different sexualities. So, that would be legal to social. It also goes the other way around. So, from social to legal. So, if you are in a debate where you have to prioritize social change, so for example, as an LGBT movement, you would be prioritizing pride parades and direct activism over voting or over advocating for gay marriage. So, in order for law to even pass and become a law, that law has to be thinkable and has to be desirable. So, first of all, people need to know that it is something that's even possible and feasible in today's world. And they also need to want it. They also need to see how there's a real problem that we see, and we need a law to fix that problem. So you need to create sense of urgency, a sense of necessity for people to even vote for a certain law to pass. The thing about laws is also laws can be revoked, even if we pass a certain law for gay marriage to be equal to straight marriage. That law can be revoked in a few years. An example of the United States would be, if you have administration which is Republican for a longer period of time, it is very possible for certain progressive laws to be revoked in that timeline. So laws are not something which is as definite and as long-term as social progress. Um, yeah, sorry, there was a mix-up on my slides, but the last thing I want to talk about here is that legal change without social acceptance leads to backlash. This is another argument you can use when you're advocating for social change. What does this mean? This means that even if you achieve legal change and you achieve it almost by force, almost by going against wishes of the majority of society, that means that most of the society will revolt against it or will not be as accepting, and that causes backlash. Backlash then leads to different types of voting. It leads sometimes to hate crimes, and it can be a way to make situation even worse for people of the LGBT community or any community in general. So, two mechanisms that you should probably write down and use in a lot of debates about social movements is when advocating from legal to social, you want first legal to create normalization. If you're advocating for social change, you can advocate that also leads to legal change. And you need social change because it's more long term. It offers a better situation for the people you're talking about, and you are avoiding backlash in this way. And a small reminder, you can use this also in debates about feminism, about the environmental movement, about Black Lives Matter, any types of movement, any social change. This is the mechanism to use. All right. The very last thing I want to talk about is what are the modern challenges of the community and what will the future look like? So, a very important problem that we're facing today is commercialization. That is something which is not specific to this community at all. It's just one of the branches in which commercialization is very, very much present. An example of another movement where this would be happening more and more is also feminism. And what this means is that companies have oftentimes taken Pride parades and Pride Month. So this month, Happy Pride Month. They take it and they commercialize it in the sense of selling products, of saying that they support the community, of using rainbow flags everywhere, but in reality, still exploiting the community, still not changing anything in their internal structure, and just using it as advertisement. And this term is sometimes called rainbow capitalism. There is also a motion this House supports or regrets rainbow capitalism. So that essentially means, any kind of capitalism, but in a form of pretending to support LGBT community, but actually not helping by donating to them, not helping with giving them free, safe spaces, for example, and still remaining the same capitalist exploitative company which was beforehand. Another important challenge is intersectionality. It's not really a challenge, but it's more of a direction into which the community is going. And in my opinion, that is an excellent direction. So intersectionality means recognizing that not all of the community looks the same and faces the same issues, but that, for example, a gay man who is Latino or a gay man who is of a lower class and of some different ethnicity has a completely different and oftentimes worse experience than a gay white wealthy man. So it's recognizing that just because you are LGBT doesn't mean you are only discriminated on the basis of that, but that there are intersections such as race, gender, religion, based on which you are also discriminated. So here there's a big link with feminism. So the link would be not all women are discriminated in the same way, but women are also discriminated on the basis of their ethnicity, on the basis of religion and class. And as a result, we should also adapt our solutions according to that. So not every person who is gay will be happy with the same solution because they face different problems. An example of that in real life would be um, advocating for housing for the LGBT community and recognizing that for a lot of gay men, they still cannot find housing because of their sexuality. They're oftentimes discriminated, maybe not in the US, but in a lot of other countries. And seeing that that is still a big problem of the community, even though that LGBT has not been focusing on housing for the last 10 years. So seeing that someone who is very poor versus someone who is wealthy and still gay, they have completely different experiences when it comes to everyday challenges. Another aspect of this would be just acknowledging privileges. And this is something which has been luckily popularized in the last few years, is basically checking your privilege, something which hasn't even been talked about 20 years ago. So this goes hand in hand with intersectionality, but it's basically encouraging people, especially people who have different types of privileges in our society, to check them and to act accordingly. So those privileges are specifically being white, oftentimes also being pretty in the sense of traditionally aesthetically pleasing, people who are wealthy and people who are Western, to acknowledge for themselves that they're oftentimes taking space which could go to other people. For example, they're taking jobs or opportunities which are not available to other people, and they themselves are taking opportunities away, not actively, but just by having that privilege. So luckily, this is another trend that the community is focusing on. And the last thing is allies. So allies have not been the focus of the community in the last few decades, but they have been more important in the last 10 years. And that is especially because 30 years ago, legal changes were the priority. So just being able to get married, have a child, go to job normally, have healthcare, those were the priorities. So legal matters. Today, a lot of those legal matters have been achieved more or less, especially in Western countries. And that's why social changes are more important oftentimes. Social changes such as being accepted, breaking stereotypes, all the things I talked about earlier when I talked about specific issues and pop culture and so on. And for that, we need critical mass of people to change their minds, open their hearts, and be just more accepting of the community. So that is why we could argue that allies are now more important than ever, and allies are the key to reaching that social change that we want in order to make society completely equal for all. All right, drill time for this workshop is going to be a little more fun and a little less work. Don't worry, it's still work, but it's a quiz. I personally think that quizzes are a little more just fun to do than writing, which can sometimes be dry. So here is the link to the quiz. Feel free to copy paste it or take a picture. If for some reason the link doesn't work, also feel free to email me on the email address here, and I would be happy to just share the link with you once again. Okay, thank you so much for attending this lecture. I hope you learned something new, and I hope this will also help you in debates. I'll be happy to talk to you about this topic more if you have any thoughts about it. If you have any suggestions or any more questions, feel free to email me. And again, thank you so much for being here, and I hope you have a nice day wherever you are and whatever time it is.